Hello, my friends. Welcome to my corner. 2 years ago, I received the following comment to one of my videos from my friend Ralph. This is what he said. I hope you will review Bioy Casares someday, but not La Invención de Morel, I hope. I love that book, but everyone talks about it. Nobody talks about the others. This video that you are so kindly watching right now is, among other things, a response to that comment that I got 2 years ago. But I want to say this, I had been wanting to talk about Adolfo Bioy Casares almost from the moment that I decided to start this channel. He was at one point my favorite Argentine author, but then so was Jorge Luis Borges and Julio Cortázar and Ricardo Piglia and Ernesto Sábato, Juan José Saer, and basically every Argentine author except César Aira, though I am still going to talk about César Aira one of these days. So I chose a novel that not many people talk about, a novel that is not even my favorite novel by Adolfo Bioy Casares, but a novel that I just felt like rereading a few days ago. This was completely on a whim. So today, my friend, we are going to look at Diario de la Guerra del Cerdo, or Diary of the War of the Pig, which this time, when I reread it, I did so in English translation. I wanted to see what Bioy sounded like in English, so that's what I want to share some ideas with you about. The first thing I want to do is to tell you a little bit about my experience with Adolfo Bioy Casares. I am pretty sure that the first book that I read by him was La aventura de un fotógrafo en La Plata, or The Adventure of a Photographer in La Plata. Strange, isn't it? I was at my university's library, they had a copy of that, I saw the title, I liked the title, and I read it. I had no idea what was Bioy Casares' most famous novel, I didn't really know anything about him. This was back in the day, okay? I read it, I liked it, but I wanted to explore more by him, and that's how I got to La Invención de Morel, of course. Now here's the interesting thing. I liked the premise of La Invención de Morel on my first reading, but I didn't like the style. I have no idea why, but I can tell you, I remember that's exactly how I felt about that book. And after that came El Sueño de los Héroes, or The Dream of Heroes. I didn't get that one. So at that point I was like, okay, I'm not going to waste my time with Bioy Casares again. That's how I felt about him. Now, some years later, I decided to specialize in Argentine literature, or at least in Southern Cone literature. So, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, Bolivia, all of those countries that make up the Southern Cone. So I told myself, if I'm going to specialize in that, I need to read a little bit more, because my knowledge of Argentine literature at that point was not what it could have been. And I went to the section for Argentine literature, and I saw once again the books of Adolfo Bioy Casares, and I was like, okay, let's give this guy another chance. Very, very condescending of me. And I just can't tell you what happened, but I began to read some of the other books by Bioy Casares that I had not read before, and I absolutely fell in love. Okay, just like that. It's unexplainable. That's the way it is most of the time with love, so I guess that makes sense, okay? But that was my experience with him. Let's move on to Diario de la Guerra del Cerdo, or Diary of the War of the Pig. Sometime, okay, somewhere in the middle of all that story that I just told you, I went back to Buenos Aires. I visited my native city once again. And in one of the 1001 bookstores that I visited, I found this copy of the novel right here, and I had to buy something. Okay, it was one of those times when I couldn't find really a whole lot that I was interested in, so I thought, okay, let's take this book. It was a used bookstore. I can't even tell you how much this cost. It was probably the equivalent of $2 or $1 or something like that. I really enjoyed it. Okay, I really enjoyed it. And with some novels, as you know, it's all about premise. Okay, it's not so much about the characters or the plot, but it is about the premise. And I think this is a really good example of that type of text. What happens in Diary of the War of the Pig is that a war breaks out between the young and the elderly. Though I want to say this, the title I feel is a little bit misleading. It's a bit of a misnomer right there, because more than a war, what we have is aggression on the part of the young towards the elderly, with the elderly basically doing the best that they can to hide, escape, and survive. So I think that's a little bit of a better description than the kind of idea that we would get when we read War of the Pig. Let's talk about the characters. Okay, we have a protagonist. His name is Don Isidro Vidal. He's referred to as Vidal for the most part by the narrator throughout the novel. And this novel follows his reaction to the violence and also the reaction of his group of friends. Because what we have at the center of this novel, we do have that protagonist, but we have a group of friends. These are men who are over 60. But Vidal is not. He's a little bit younger than the others. So he finds himself in a kind of threshold, in a kind of no man's land, as he calls it himself. And interestingly, Vidal is around the age that Bioy Casares was when he wrote the novel. So this is obviously fiction, but there's quite a bit of autobiography to it. It's veiled autobiography, inventive autobiography, fantastic autobiography, but it's still based a lot on some of the things that Bioy Casares was going through at the level of his personal life. But that brings us to genre. Okay, you read the title and it says Diary of the War of the Pig. We do have a diary here, but this is not a first-person diary. I don't know how you feel about novels that are a diary written in the first person. In my experience, I tend not to enjoy those too much. There are certainly exceptions, of course, but this is a third-person diary. We get some dates, but it's not narrated by Vidal himself. And the time period that is covered is just about 10 days. Okay, we don't know for sure because the last part, we don't get a date. We get a few days later. But you can calculate the time, and it is just about 10 days in the lives of these characters. By what I have told you so far, you can tell that this is an example of what in Latin America we call relato fantástico. That would mean fantasy, but it's a different type of fantasy. It's not what fantasy means in the rest of the world. I think a better label for it, not that I care about labels or anything, but I think I would describe it as speculative fiction. Not because that is a more precise label, but precisely because it is a more vague label. And I think in this case, we do really want to go with something that is more encompassing than saying fantasy, for example. This is one of those really good what-if stories. What if the young decided to declare war on the elderly, okay? Just so you know, it has been called an example of alternate reality dystopia. So maybe that's another way that we can think about it, though I think that is also a little bit limiting when it comes to this type of novel. But as you may know, right, if you're a fan of Bioy, there are mostly two threads to his work. One is, of course, fantasy. We have already said that. But the other one is romance. If you look at Bioy's best work, his best stories are a great combination of those two elements, the fantasy element and the romance element. And in this case, in the case of Diary of the War of the Pig, we also have another thing into the mix, which is mystery. There's a sense of mystery to this novel. So it's a really, really nice blend, as you can tell. Let me tell you a little bit now about the structure and the style, two things that I like to combine most of the time. So Diary of the War of the Pig is just about 200 pages long, and I want to try an experiment here. Try to guess how many chapters it has. 200 pages long, okay? If you're a fan of Bioy, you're not going to be surprised at this. 49 chapters, okay? 200 pages, 49 chapters. Bioy Casares' style is consists of many things, right? But one of the things that I like about it is that the chapters are very, very brief. That's one of the many reasons why I love Bioy Casares. I see that also in me. When I try to write something, I tend to go for very brief chapters. Another reason why I love Bioy Casares is just the style itself. It's a style that is very concise, it is unadorned, it is direct, and it has great touches of irony and sarcasm. Bioy Casares just has a great sense of humor, okay? And that is something that you're going to find in all of his books, no matter how dark they are. So the story that is presented to us, if we're going to talk about the plot a little bit here, in Diary of the War of the Pig, is a very simple story, as a matter of fact. We have a group of men who are advanced in age dealing with the uncomfortable fact that the youth want them dead. Okay, they realize this, and the novel really does focus on the men, though there are women characters, right? We have female characters, but most of the women that we encounter in the novel are young, so they belong to the other faction in this war of the ages that we encounter in this text. So early in the novel, one of the first things or the first events that we hear about is that there's a group of young men beating an elderly man to death. It's very, very violent. And it made me think of this great novel, one of my favorites, which is, of course, A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. Like A Clockwork Orange, Diary of the War of the Pig could be described as a grotesque allegory of the generation gap and or the fear of aging. And there's also an element of fantasy. Fantasy not in the sense that I was talking about before when it comes to the genre, but the kind of fantasy that you find, for example, in this idea of the older man and the younger woman. So in the romance aspect of the novel, if you will. Now, of course, as usual, Bioy is highly symbolic, okay, in all of his works, but in this one in particular. One of the first things that happen in the novel is that Vidal, the protagonist, loses his teeth. Okay, he goes to a dentist, and the dentist tells him, he recommends, you should get all of your teeth extracted, and he does that, and he gets dentures. So just think about that. I mean, Vidal literally loses his teeth. He's being rendered more harmless. I mean, Freud would have had so much fun with this novel for many reasons, okay? But here's another one. The young trying to destroy the elderly. I mean, did anybody say Oedipus complex? I mean, this is just Freud all over the place. And in the novel, this revolt that we have of the youth against the elderly is or could be interpreted as an impulse to destroy the past. The elderly represent the past right here, but it is also an example of self-disgust, because as we all know, youth is temporary, right? Given enough time, all of us are going to become elderly. So you could say, in that sense, looking at it that way, that the premise of the novel doesn't really make sense. And that's part of the point. Part of the point here is that this is an example, or could be considered an example, of an absurd type of story, or even an absurdist type of story. So that is another thing that we want to consider when we approach this novel, The War of the Pig. Now, consider also the time period, okay? Bioy Casares wrote and published this novel in 1969. This was a very turbulent time in Argentina. You had many examples of youth in revolt. The students were, rising up and all that kind of stuff. And it really foreshadowed what was going to happen in Argentina later on, especially towards the later part of the 1970s. We have, as you may know, that very bloody dictatorship starting 1976. So this is a foreshadowing of that. But going beyond Argentina, we also have to remember the events of May of 1968 in Paris. Okay, so all of this is in the mix. Okay, there is also that you're going to find this at one point of not so subtle comment on how the government responds to the war and the aggression. The government is completely useless when it comes to putting a stop to this conflict, and that is part of the social commentary in the novel. So, at the risk of stating the obvious, this type of fantasy, right, good fantasy, is not mere escapism, as you can see as an example in this novel, but it's just an inventive way of exploring truths, right, of exploring a very concrete reality, and also deep-rooted anxieties, such as the ones that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. I want to talk now a little bit about the depiction of the elderly, and then about the depiction of youth in this novel. The novel shows, among other things, that age is relative. In a sense, age is just a number. To give you an example, the elderly guys, the group of friends, they refer to themselves as the boys, or los muchachos in Spanish. They consider themselves to be young. This reminded me, something that I encountered quite a while ago. I remember the first time that I heard my students saying to each other, when you're 30, you're old already. And I was like, wow, it's really relative when you start thinking about it that way. But anyway, back to the characters in the novel. They don't consider themselves to be old or elderly or anything like that. They have energy and they have wit, just like young people. And there are many examples in this novel of argumentation. You're going to find a lot of that. It's really a novel that is driven by dialogue. So that is part of what I appreciate about this text also. Let me tell you what I mean a little bit when I say that this is a novel that includes argumentation. There's a part here where you get the arguments of both sides, okay? So the ideas of the elderly and the ideas of the young. For example, on page 43, one of the characters says, "Why do old people arouse such hatred? Because they are too self-satisfied and they won't make way for young people." That is one argument right there. A little bit later on, the same character asks, "Shall I make way for incompetents just because they are young? Give up all I've worked for? Just hand over the reins?" So you have examples of that throughout the novel. That's what I mean by argumentation. There's one point in which the narrator says, "At heart, every man is a boy disguised as a grown-up." So plenty of insight into what it means to quote-unquote grow up, to become older, and all of those sorts of topics. And I think that idea, the idea of every man being a boy disguised as a grown-up, is something that this novel illustrates very well. So that is the depiction of the elderly. Let's move on now to the depiction of youth. Most of the young people in this novel appear as part of a nameless, violent mob, okay? There are individual characters, but for the most part, when we hear about the youth, it is in those terms. Let me read you something here from page 105. It says right here, this is Arevalo, one of the characters, speaking. "And this is the youth that's supposed to think for itself. It thinks and acts like a herd of sheep." And a little bit below that, "There's no place for the individual anymore. There's nothing left but animals that are born, breed, and then die. Some of these animals happen to be endowed with a conscience the way others have wings or horns." So once again, the idea here is of a crowd. These are the young people. But once again, we also have individual characters, okay? And I think the most important ones that I could identify were the sons of two of the characters. One is Vidal's son. His name is Isidorito. Vidal's original name is Isidoro, okay? Then there's a character named Nestor, and he has a son who also appears prominently in the novel. The son's name is Nestor also. So you can see what Bioy is doing right here. The elderly and the young, they have the same names. Okay? They are a continuity, and they don't seem to realize that. That is part of the irony. That is part of the absurdity of this novel. But more importantly, besides those male characters that are young, the women here, the young women, are much more important. The most important one of those is a young woman by the name of Nélida. And this is a young woman that Vidal has a strong attraction for. That is the romance element of the novel, and that's all that I'm going to say about that so as not to ruin the reading experience for you. So I mentioned before that Bioy has a sense of humor, and I wanted to read you a couple of examples of that just so you can see what it is that I mean by that sense of humor. For example, Vidal and his son lived on the son's earnings. It never occurred to them to pay the rent until it occurred to the government to pay Vidal his pension. So a little humor right there, but it is also something that is deeply rooted in reality, as people in Argentina know, unfortunately. Those who are retired are always struggling, and this is an example of that. And then another little touch of humor that I thought I might share with you was this one. This is on page 22. And this is Vidal right here. Heating water for his mate. Okay, that is how the sentence begins. So a very prosaic action. You know what mate is? That thing that the Argentines are always drinking. So heating water for his mate, he reflected that in the course of a lifetime, however short, we are 2 or 3 people in succession. So notice how he goes from the very ordinary to something more philosophical. And you expect something really, really deep coming here. This is how it continues. For instance, he had first been a man who liked his mate bitter. Next, a man who would not touch it because it disagreed with him. And now he had acquired a taste for mate with sugar. I think it's amazing how we start with something prosaic, he lifts us up, and then he takes us back down to earth. He's talking about mate. When he says that thing, we are three people in one, you expect something really deep. Now, I want to read you this part also in Spanish, just in case you understand the language, or you can read it, just to show you the difference right here. So, this is how it sounds in the original. Al poner a calentar el agua para el mate, meditó que una vida, por breve que sea, alcanza para 2 o 3 hombres. Con relación al mate, él fue un hombre que lo requería siempre amargo. Después, uno que no lo tomaba porque le caía mal, y ahora se había convertido en un fiel devoto de los mates dulces. The reason why I want to read that in Spanish is because I feel that the English translation in this case doesn't quite capture the full irony and sarcasm that is going on right here. So he says that un hombre que lo requería, he required his mate to be bitter. It's very different to say that he liked his mate bitter. And then towards the end of a sentence, when the narrator says, se había convertido en un fiel devoto de los mates dulces. He had been a faithful devotee of sweet mate. When you say fiel devoto, that is something that the type of phrase that we use when we say that somebody is deeply devout of a given saint or something like that. So the language is really, really good. Now, I do want to say, however, I don't think that is the fault of the translators. Okay, I think, as I said before, this reads, I think I said it before, if not, please forgive me, but this reads very well in English, okay? All translation is approximation. What we have here is just a language issue. So I really want to applaud and to congratulate the translators of this book, because it really, really is a very good job that they did. The English version was published in 1972, so only 3 years after the original was published in Spanish. And the translation is by Gregory Woodruff and Donald A. Yates. It was published by McGraw-Hill. So great version that we have of Bioy Casares in English right here. Now, I must say a word about the ending, but I promise I'm not going to spoil it for you. Okay, but it's important that we talk about this. The ending is abrupt. It's something that you are going to notice. The first time that I read the novel, when I read it in Spanish many years ago, it was a bit of a letdown, primarily because throughout my reading experience I kept wondering, how is Bioy going to get out of this mess that he has created? How is he going to solve this issue or come to some sort of conclusion? Now, this time around when I read it, and this was probably because I was expecting the ending the way it is, the effect on me was completely different. I was reminded of the ending of José Saramago's Blindness. That's all that I'm going to say in terms of details, okay? I think part of the point here is that the ending really, in a way, doesn't matter. What this novel presents is a nightmare, just like you can find in the Report on the Blind in Ernesto Sábatos on Heroes and Tombs, though not as dark as that. But this is a nightmare, so I think we shouldn't really look for logic in this case, unless, of course, we are talking about the logic of dreams and or nightmares. There is a film adaptation of Diary of the War of the Pig. It's an Argentine film by Leopoldo Torre Nilsson, who is, this is going to be absurd what I'm going to say, but he is a little bit of our Ingmar Bergman, okay, the Argentine filmmaker who put Argentine cinema on the map, who took it to the film festivals and that kind of thing. And the movie is from 1975, so 6 years later. Argentina had changed a lot in that time. He changed the title, okay, so it was his next to last film, and he changed the title to La Guerra del Cerdo, so the War of the Pig. The diary part is gone, which I think makes sense when you're translating this to cinematic language. It has music by Gato Barbieri, very, very good score, and it is not really regarded as one of Torre Nilsson's best films, not even close, but I think it is very well done. I just watched it again this morning in preparation to put together this video so that I could tell you a little bit, a couple of words about the film adaptation. So it is, I would describe it as atmospheric. Okay, it really does a very good job of capturing the tension of this novel, because, by the way, this is a novel of great tension. Okay, that is a key element in the composition of this text. Now, what happens is some of the differences, right? The violence is much more brutal because you're watching a film. You're seeing the violence, not necessarily the violent act. I wouldn't say that this is a graphic film. but it is definitely more brutal than the novel. You see maybe the aftermath of the assaults or the aggression. So it really puts it right there in your face. And mind you, this violence is not just physical, it is also verbal. You don't get a lot of verbal violence in the novel, but you do get a lot of that in the film. And another big difference, and this is the unfortunate part, is that Bioy's humor is just virtually gone in the film, because you can't translate that from the page to the screen, the irony of the narrator's voice, for example. So I read the novel, I had an experience, I watched the film, and I was like, wow, this is a much darker story. But it's a story that works at both levels, really. So, the bottom line. If you have read La Invención de Morel, please read Asleep in the Sun and The Dream of Heroes. That would be my recommendation to you. But if you decided to go with the Diary of the War of the Pig, I personally see no problem with that. Okay, I think it's going to be perfect, and you are going to enjoy Bioy Casares the way that he wrote most of the time. Now here's something. I wanted to share something with you that I heard in an interview with Bioy Casares that I watched yesterday. It's available here on YouTube. At one point, the interviewer asked him, Bioy, do you believe in man? Do you believe in the human being? And Bioy Casares said, of course. And he explained why. He said, I think we are all heroes because all of us have to face death. And I was like, wow. You know, this was probably one of the last interviews with Bioy Casares. And I was like, what a wonderful way of looking at the human condition, right? So that is something that I wanted you to please keep in mind as you read Bioy Casares, and especially if you decide to read Diary of the War of the Pig. We are all heroes because we have to face death. It's very, very interesting stuff. So I'm definitely going to talk about Bioy Casares again. Heck, if it were up to me, I would do videos on all of his books. I don't know if that's going to happen, but you know, it's certainly something that I would like to do. But there's definitely going to be more to come about him. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. Those were my 2 cents on Diario de la Guerra del Cerdo, Diary of the War of the Pig, a very good novel by the great Argentine author Adolfo Bioy Casares. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.